I am Isabel from Wisconsin Land and Water, and thank you for joining us today. As you just heard, I am going to be recording this webinar, and it'll be posted on the Wisconsin Land and Water website at some point in the near future. And then I will also be sending the YouTube link to everyone who signed up as soon as it's available, along with a link to an evaluation. So today our presentation will be given by Mike Dreschmeyer. And the way that we're also going to be going forward is that we are going to be taking questions throughout the presentation through the chat line, which is on the bottom toolbar, and you can submit a question at any time and we will get them answered as soon as we can. And so without any further ado, Mike, you can please take it away. Mike, if you're speaking, I believe you're muted. Yep.
No, I'm working on it.
Okay, perfect.
all the prep work, and it still comes down to the last minute here trying to get things organized, and the computer glitched just 2 minutes ago and I lost my sharing for you guys, so we'll work through this. Thanks, Isabel. As Isabel mentioned, my name is Mike Dreschmeyer. I'm the Southwest Area Engineer for NRCS located in Richland Center. I've been the area engineer here since 2004. I've also worked previously in Eau Claire, Stevens Point, and Dodgeville. I also worked for the Pierce County Land Conservation Department when I got out of school, and spent summers with Sauk County and Columbia County Land Conservation Departments. So been around the state, been around for a while, almost 25 years now with NRCS. I originally grew up on a dairy farm in northern Sauk County and graduated from UW-Madison with a degree in agricultural engineering. On the presentation with us today too is Steve Becker. He's our state conservation engineer with NRCS. He's going to help me monitor the chat box and answer the easy questions and maybe answer the hard questions too. I will try to stop a couple times maybe through the presentation and try answering questions that have come up. We should have a little bit of time at the end for some additional questions as well. So I'm going to shut off my camera here through most of the presentation. Again, we've had a few computer glitches in the past, and I'm hoping to avoid that. Plus, as my video glitches out, it'll stop those uncomfortable pauses of my video. All right, hopefully everybody can see the presentation here. Today's training is meant to discuss the planning of stream bank projects in Wisconsin, including when we can implement stream bank protection, how much we can do, and what other alternatives we should be looking at. Planning, as you guys know, is a complex process that involves many disciplines besides engineering, and is also highly dependent on different program and landowner goals, objectives, and resources as well. Unfortunately, the answers aren't easy, but today we'll try to lay out a planning process to help you make these decisions. There are 2 additional trainings coming up soon to go into more detail about stream site assessments and to dig deeper into stream impairments and ways to correct them. Today we'll review more of the desktop assessments and how to collect background information. I'll try to answer the question of what can I do without all the additional assessment and stream classification. One other thing I want to mention just as we get started here is I know there's been a lot of frustration about what we're supposed to be doing and that not enough guidance has been given so far. So this training and the next couple are an attempt to help provide that guidance and move us forward. However, there's no way to answer everyone's questions on all sites through a couple webinars. So I would encourage staff to do your basic assessments that you're comfortable with, put some basic proposals together, and ask your area engineering staff, whether it's NRCS or DATCAP, for an opinion on projects, and then proceed with final design. So I wouldn't continue waiting for more guidance. what you're going to get over the next couple weeks is kind of what you're going to get for now. And then from there on, just do what you've done in the past, plan projects, put together some ideas, and on a case-by-case basis, we can review those and just keep moving forward. And as we, just go through projects and work through them, we're going to figure out the best way forward on these. So the overview today, we're going to talk a little bit again about the Wisconsin instruction, and then kind of go through the planning process and really kind of talk about a lot of the things that you can do in your office before you even get out to the site. All right, so how did we get here? Just a reminder that about a year ago, these 4 standards were released after a lengthy revision process. And we did hold 2 previous training sessions on 580 stream bank and shoreline protection and 582 open channel this spring. They were pretty good technical sessions, but still left a lot of questions on how to plan projects and how to move forward. So hopefully today will be another step in the right direction on that. And then over the next couple of weeks, the additional trainings hopefully will help cover the additional assessments required in standard 582 open channel. And then I think, we're still going to need additional training after that. I think we could use some additional training on stream habitat improvement. That's one that's really hard to do desktop assessment of and desktop training on. So hopefully we can get some field days scheduled probably in next spring. The other thing with the open channel is we're going to cover a lot of the assessments over the next couple weeks, but then the question always remains, how do I take what I've assessed and put it into a construction plan? So we'll try giving some more guidance on that down the road as well. All right, on the next couple slides here, we're going to talk a little bit about the Wisconsin NRCS instruction that was issued. So a state NRCS instruction is a detailed instruction or procedure on a specific subject. And in this case, it's on stream bank protection. It's issued by our state conservationist and covers the conditions for applying the practice of stream bank protection in Wisconsin. It really applies to projects where NRCS is providing financial or technical assistance. So then half of you that are on the call are probably saying that you don't work for NRCS. Do you have to follow this? So this instruction again covers projects where NRCS is providing financial or technical assistance. So projects that are looking to receive funding from EQIP or RCPP, this instruction would apply. Or if it's projects where you're looking for myself or NRCS staff to do plan approvals, construction approvals, that sort of thing, those would fall under this as well. Now, although this doesn't cover county or state funded projects, I know DACAP engineers are generally following the same guidelines. I don't know that, this doesn't, the specific policy doesn't apply to them, but the general guidelines and instruction that's provided here, they're trying to maintain some continuity and generally follow the same guidelines. If you're working on projects that are not NRCS financial or technical assistance projects and you wonder whether it applies or want information on the planning of those projects, I would refer to your DACAP engineering staff for those questions. So I'll be referring to this instruction a little bit throughout the afternoon here. So just a couple highlights from this instruction. Wisconsin NRCS supports fluvio-geomorphic processes of alluvial streams. So what does this mean? It means that streams naturally migrate across the floodplain and that it's part of a natural process. However, excessive movement can result in soil erosion that affects water quality and fish habitat. So we need to provide sufficient assessment to document the excessive stream bank erosion. And through this instruction, excessive is considered greater than 1/2 foot per year. 1/2 foot per year is kind of a minimum amount. I know it's still not real aggressive. It really depends on how long a period you're looking at. A lot of times you can lose large amounts during a specific storm event, and then the stream may stay in the same place for years. So trying to kind of evaluate that over time is important as well. Another item on here is that stream bank protection is intended to protect isolated stream banks from excessive erosion and is not intended to create a near continuous sequence of stream bank protection. So I think that's a legitimate question that I've gotten before and think is important is what is isolated and what is, near continuous sequence of bank protection. And I don't think we're going to be able to define that exactly for you. But here's just a slide that I just wanted to show of a stream corridor and just give a visual of what isolated banks might look like. So in this scenario, out of all this corridor here, I've selected four stream banks that if we documented excessive erosion on where they're encroaching on cropland and fences that the landowner was concerned about dealing with, I would consider these isolated banks. If we want to come in and address every bend on here that's moving, and our riprap plan is all of these red sites and the green sites, this would be more near continuous protection. So this is maybe an obvious example and the devil's in the details, right, of your particular site, but this just kind of gives you an idea of what isolated versus near continuous looks like. I think the take home point here is if you're trying to address an entire stream corridor that's unstable in every corner, that we need to look at it a little bit further than just looking at it on a stream bank protection and a bank by bank basis. So rather than just applying the 580 practice over and over again on every corner, we may need to look at like the root causes of the instability of the system, what's going on, and whether there's other things that may need to be done to address the issue rather than just rock. And in the end, we may end up with the same answer, but the assessment will tell us if there's other things such as shaping on the opposite bank or other plan form changes that we can make to help address the situation. So again, anytime that you're planning on clearing, shaping, or rocking an entire stream corridor, more thought and assessment is needed to identify overall impairments in the system. All right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but there is a limitation on the instruction on the watershed size limit, and this limit is less than 390 square miles. This doesn't impact us very often, but here's a couple of sites in the southwest part of the state that would be impacted. So the Baraboo River, once we get past Reedsburg, exceeds this limit, so you could work on the Baraboo River upstream from Reedsburg, but not downstream. The Kickapoo River reaches this limit near Reedstown. The Wisconsin River reaches it way up north, so the Wisconsin River and Mississippi River would be excluded from it. All right, so let's talk about the planning process. So NRCS has a 9-step conservation planning process, which is shown here. We often shortcut the planning process to get from the problem to the solution or try finding places where we can implement the solution. But I think trying to be a little bit more thoughtful on these projects is kind of what we're trying to promote here. So trying to think about this and go through the phases and the steps. Now, a lot of these individual steps are intertwined and they're hard to kind of unpack. So a lot of times they're lumped together. So phase 1 is kind of this collection and analysis. Even though we have a lot of stuff that we can do in phase 1, everybody always kind of wants to cut to the end of phase 2, which is make decisions and implement the plan. But we kind of want to keep going through this process. So multiple alternatives may need to be at least considered and evaluated to get to the point of making decisions. Sometimes, again, we may end up with the same decision in the end, but I think some of the alternatives just need a little bit further evaluation and at least offer them and make sure that we're considering them. So work through the entire process to develop good alternatives and use the system to help work out those alternatives and make final decisions. So everyone interested in stream projects and stream bank protection should review these two documents. They're found in the Wisconsin supplements to Chapter 16 of the Engineering Field Handbook. So if you go to the Wisconsin NRCS homepage and go to the Engineering tab, you can get to the Engineering Field Handbook supplements. So they share a lot of the background information that we're covering today, and especially these first two sections that talk about the anatomy of a healthy stream and trying to identify stream stability problems and trying to really identify the root causes of what's causing the instability rather than just addressing what we're seeing as the outward sign of erosion. The other thing I wanted to mention is these supplements that are in EFH Chapter 16 haven't changed since the last revision of the standard. In fact, a lot of what the new standard and changes really goes back and just emphasizes the old planning process that was put together in 2009. So the stuff in 2009 contained the same discussion on natural channel design. It contained the same assessments we'll be covering over the next couple trainings. And even the old standard really tried leading people in this direction of natural channel design and trying to further evaluate the sites rather than just installing stream bank protection. So the basic idea here is really to evaluate the stream in its entirety to identify underlying impairments and try to address those impairments to the best of our ability rather than trying to fix some of the symptoms. All right, so the first step of the planning process is to identify problems. So problems are identified early on in the planning process, but really they're further documented throughout the process and usually aren't finalized until all the data is analyzed in step 4, analyze resource data. At this time in the beginning of the process, you're going to gather the landowner's concerns and their perceived problems, which may not exactly line up with our resource concerns. So a lot of times the landowner's concerns are that they're losing cropland. It may be flood damage to their fields. Sometimes it's just that they're seeing raw banks and know there's erosion and that's something that NRCS has been fixing in the past and that they would like to see their streams fixed and not have the excessive erosion. Sometimes these are perceived problems and sometimes they're real problems. But again, part of this is identifying what their issues are, why did they come to us in the first place. And then again, the way we would look at identifying some of those problems are our resource concerns. And at this point, we're just looking at really general resource concerns. Are we talking about soil erosion? Are we looking at water quality? Is plant condition an issue here, whether it's a box elder line corridor or an overgrazed pasture? And then habitat for fish and wildlife, is that something that's a problem on this site? Is it well known for being a good trout stream, or is it an impaired stream? There's a lot of things that in this step, you're just trying to identify those general problems. And then step 2 is kind of trying to determine objectives, and these usually tie right in with the problems, right? So there's a lot of different objectives we can have when it comes to stream work. Some of these are landowner objectives and some would be agency objectives. Trying to focus on common objectives will result in successful projects. Be careful of conflicting objectives and do a good job trying to resolve these before proceeding with a project. For example, if a landowner wants to see no stream movement and our agency objective is to allow natural movement of a stream, and if those are in conflict for a particular project, it's not going to lead to a successful outcome. I know we've had issues in the past where The landowner's problem was that the field was flooding, and we did a stream bank protection on one of the bends, and we got called out later because the landowner was very upset, and to find out that the reason why he was upset is that his field was still flooding. Well, the stream bank protection controlled the erosion, but it didn't stop the flooding issue. And so that was an issue where the objectives were different between what the landowner really wanted and what our project was. So try to make sure that not only we're understanding the landowner's problems, but what their objectives are and what a successful outcome of the project will look like. So a lot of these are objectives that are, shared between us and the landowner: controlling erosion, reducing sediment delivery, um, improving fish and wildlife habitat, protecting cropland, roads or structures may be important, and improving the vegetative community. But again, there's different ways that these can be in conflict with each other. For instance, if part of the issue is overgrazing and we can identify that as a problem, but the landowner isn't interested in changing management or changing stocking rates or anything, that those are going to be difficult to overcome in a successful project. Step 3 of the planning process is going to be inventorying resources. So part of today's is to try looking at a lot of the items that we can take a look at before going to the field and starting to develop potential alternatives. And it also gives us additional items to take a closer look at when we go to the field. And so by reviewing a lot of this ahead of time, it'll save multiple trips to the field. Sometimes we can do a better job preparing for our first site visit by doing a good job reviewing this stuff in the office. So some simple things on here. We're going to get into a little bit more detail on these, but the stream type, whether they're trout streams, whether it's cold water or warm water, whether it's on the 303D list for impaired streams and what those impairments are, what the adjacent land use is, what the watershed above the area looks like, the stream movement and history is all stuff we can gather ahead of time. Information on the floodplains, the wetlands, and vegetation as well. All right, then here's kind of a list of some of these sources. The Wisconsin DNR Surface Water Data Viewer is got a ton of information in it. Sometimes it takes a little bit to find exactly what you want on there. There's different themes that are available that when you go on there, it at least kind of categorizes some of the layers into groupings that are all relative to either floodplains or dams or wetlands. And even if you pick the wrong theme, there's ways to get into other groupings of layers, or you can have them list all the layers in there. So if you guys aren't familiar with the Surface Water Data Viewer, definitely get in there and use it to kind of look through the amount of information they have. So here's just a few things that you can find on there that are useful. The trout stream information, it will tell you what class of trout stream it is. It has layers that list the areas of special natural resource interest. It lists the 303D waters, and it also lists what information is causing those impairments. So just because it's on a 303D list, sometimes that's for temperature, sometimes it's for nutrients such as phosphorus, and sometimes it's for sediment. So that is helpful that way. Floodplain mapping we'll talk about in a second. You can find past permits. So they have a list of all, I don't know, probably over the last 10 or 15 years since they started doing a lot of this online. You can get links to previous permits that were done. Navigability determinations, some of those are loaded in there. And then wetland indicators we'll talk about a little bit as well here too. So many of the streams also have links to additional information, including overview descriptions of the stream, general conditions, potential goals, and past monitoring information that the DNR has for that particular reach. So if you click on the particular stream, there's a way to go to view more data about that stream, and it'll bring up a link that contains a lot of helpful information. Um, as far as the trout stream and habitat, we're not going to talk a lot about stream habitat improvement today, but the local fisheries biologists are really good resources as well to get more information on what the impairments are in a stream and what they really would like to see that would improve the habitat in different stretches of water as well. All right, so floodplains should be identified early on in the planning process. FEMA regulated floodplain maps are available on the DNR surface water data viewer as well. I know some of the counties I have better luck finding them than others. I know a lot of the county websites that have their own GIS data also contain floodplain information on for their own counties. And a lot of times, if you're always working in a particular county, that may be more helpful to you than going on to the DNR surface water data viewer website. A lot of times the counties will also include like their dam breach analysis, where the floodplains and those dam shadows are included in their zoning floodplains as well. And most of those would not be on the DNR website. So there's two different types of floodplains that you will see when you go into this. Some of them you have to zoom in quite a ways to get the detail on it. But the one at the bottom of the screen is considered a zone A floodplain, and they have less detail. They're still regulated. You can't place fill in them. You can't raise the water level onto the neighbors upstream. There's still limitations on them, but they just aren't as detailed of a study as you see in the top one, where it's considered a zone AE or a detailed floodplain. You'll see on that one, it actually shows where the cross sections were taken. It shows you the base flood elevation and just a lot more detail on it. There's been a lot more scrutiny put on projects recently by county zoning departments in these floodplains, and especially in the zone AE floodplains, where stream projects could impact the base flood elevations. So if you want to work in the zone AE areas, you may be required to run a HEC-RAS analysis to prove that you aren't changing the flood elevations. And tying into these existing studies can take some extra time. And even in the zone A areas, you'll likely be asked to show a no rise analysis, but that may be a little bit simpler. You'll want to work with your local zoning office to see what they want to see on these projects, and then work with your area engineering staff for assistance. I know DACCAP has been working on this as well to help detail out what needs to be done in the different cases, and is trying to kind of put out some draft guidance on how to deal with it. But just realize that when you're working in and around these floodplains, that there's going to be extra information that's going to be needed to be done. And in some cases, especially in the detailed flood zones, it's going to take quite a bit additional time. So trying to identify this early on in a project. I know a lot of times we've worked through stuff and had plans done, and in the end, the question is, well, where is the spoil going to go? And at that time, it's identified that it's in a map floodplain, and really that's something that can be done, even before going to the site for the very first time. Are there any questions on the floodplain issues from what you guys have been seeing?
Yeah, Mike, well, people are maybe thinking about a question. We're here to service our customers and address legitimate resource concerns. But if you're identifying bank erosion or habitat issues in a mapped floodplain, particularly zone AE, where the floodplain manager is going to require a no rise certification, we need to kind of know that up front, because we don't have you know, unlimited staff time either. Some of the stuff takes a couple of weeks to get through it, especially if it's the first one. We may or may not have someone with a strong skill set in running HEC-RAS and matching into existing models and demonstrating that no rise. So there is a limit, and it's good to get that squared away first before you would contract it. Even though you may have job approval authority to diagnose and prescribe 580, if you're doing it in a mapped floodplain, that's going to draw on our engineering resources for a couple of weeks. We might have a problem. So please check that and make sure that that path is clear for technical assistance before you contract in that area.
All right, thanks, Steve, for breaking up me talking for just a little bit here, so that's good. So there's a couple questions in the chat then. Paul's asking whether HEC-RAS can be run before a contract signed, and I think in some of these cases we are going to want to know a little bit more on what can be done before we get too far along in the planning. So again, we can't commit to doing that on all potential projects, but if we have projects that everybody's on board with it, we feel are good projects and we want to keep moving them along, I think having that done early on in the process is probably something that would be in everybody's best interest, just to make sure that what we're contracting isn't getting held up later, right? Because of what we find out after we do the HEC-RAS analysis. So the last question is kind of in step with that, is who can run a HEC-RAS? And there's staff from DATCAP and from NRCS that are able to do the HEC-RAS analysis. It just does take quite a bit of time. There are cases where it may need to be sent out to a private engineer as well. So I think I don't have all the answers on the specifics of how to get through one of these right now. I just want to identify it as a major hurdle that we need to get over, and for people to think about it at that time. But if you do have a project where you run into this, contact your area engineering staff, whether it's NRCS or DATCAP, right away. Let them know about the project, and let's kind of help you through the early stages of the planning on that, and try figuring out who's going to be able to do it for that particular project, what the timing is, and how it aligns with the other program application deadlines, the contracting deadlines, and all of that stuff. So definitely one to identify and to note as an issue and get it on everybody's radar at the beginning.
I think that process needs a little bit of honesty. And so before we're going to dedicate an engineer's time up to 2 weeks just trying to find the old HEC-RAS model, hopefully it's of current vintage and we're able to tie into it and get some additional survey and lay it in there. To dedicate that amount of time has a lot to do with the quality of the project that we're dealing with. So if you jump ahead and you're doing a 300-foot stream bank protection or 500-foot stream bank protection on a zone E on the Baraboo River upstream of Reedsburg, for example, yeah, you can contract it through NRCS programs, but that would be really awkward for us because we wouldn't be able to service that contract in a timely manner. And so some of these projects we may need to go back to the owner and say, look, in order to get this service in a timely manner, you have to pay for that you're going to have to cover the cost of that technical service. You might have to go to a consultant to run it. And that's just simply managing staff time and the quality of the project. So that's a lot of work for doing one stream bank corner because the floodplain manager insists on it. It's another thing to run HEC-RAS on a quarter or a half-mile reach where you're ringing the bell on multiple resource concerns, and it's a high-quality, well-supported project. It's just a whole lot different level of commitment by our agency with a limited number of staff. So I'm just a little concerned about some of these getting slipped into contracting, and we don't have the dedicated resources to get it done in a timely manner, and it makes everyone look foolish. So just be aware. I think that's the message here. It's not like we can't do it. It's not like we don't have skilled people to do it, but it's just time and resources. And it's not up to individual field employees sometimes to dedicate those resources. You need to consult with the area office and kind of work this up the chain a little bit.
All right, thanks, Steve. I think that kind of covers that, and appreciate your comments on it. And again, just identify these early on and we'll work through them. All right, wetlands is another thing that we should be looking on early on as well. So on the left here kind of shows an overview of a site with this surface water data viewer from the Wisconsin DNR shown on here. It has two different layers. One is an orange layer, which is the Wisconsin wetland inventory, which is based mostly on a vegetation analysis. And then there's also a purple layer of potential wetlands, which is more based on soil types. So wetlands can be an issue for the permitting process through the DNR and Army Corps of Engineers, whether we're disturbing wetlands with our work or whether you need to fill something in if you're doing a channel realignment, or where you're placing your fill from stream bank shaping, if that would impact wetlands. Those would all be kind of permit issues through the DNR and Army Corps of Engineers. Some of the general permits and individual permits would allow some wetland disturbance. So it's not that you can't do a project when wetlands are involved. It's just something that needs to be evaluated and work through the details on it. So the other half of the wetland issue is Farm Bill compliance. So sometimes we can do things that are allowed by the DNR and Army Corps of Engineers, but they may be an issue with the landowner maintaining Farm Bill compliance. So making wetlands croppable is kind of the main issue with wetland compliance through the Farm Bill. So if we're clearing trees or doing some fill that may lead to making it more croppable, even if they don't crop it at that time, it can lead to violations. It can also be an issue where, let's say the trees are cleared from a wetland area as part of a stream restoration, and that particular landowner doesn't intend to crop it. He doesn't have any intentions of breaking it out. He's on board with the restoration project, but 10 years from now, he sells it to somebody else and they're unaware of it. Sometimes people can end up with problems and wetland violations down the road as a second landowner. So we just want to make sure that those issues are dealt with. We can request a wetland determination. We can make sure that our area resource soil scientist and the wetland compliance team is involved just to keep people out of trouble. A lot of these corridors have a lot of wetlands in them. So it's, again, something that needs to be identified early on in the process. Again, not something that we can't work around. We just need to know about it. And again, the time to do that is right up front. All right, some more inventory sources or resources. County GIS websites often provide better floodplain mapping than the DNR surface water data viewer. They also contain tax parcel and land ownership information that can be helpful. I know a lot of times when landowners are applying for individual permits, you need to have the upstream and downstream landowner information to do notifications on. So that's one way of getting that. We often get requests for stream bank protection that's actually on land that's not owned by the person asking for the assistance. A lot of times there's property lines that cut through these stream corridors, and one of the bends may be completely or partially on land owned by somebody else. So that's always a good thing to check again early on. And it also lets you know if they only own one side of the stream or both. A lot of times it can be a difficult situation where we're trying to protect one side of the stream from moving and the other side is owned by a different owner. All right, Other inventory sources, NRCS geodata. So NRCS geodata is available to NRCS staff. It's also available to partner staff that are on our system. And some of this information you can also obtain from NRCS staff if you have a good working relationship with somebody there. So I think a lot of the information, a lot of our counties are working closely enough with NRCS that they have ways of being able to get this information. I'm going to go through a few of these in a little bit more detail. The wetland determination, some of the more recent ones are right in the geodata, so you can pull up what's been done previously to see if it's already been done. The hydric soils, and then we're going to talk a little bit about using the NRCS engineering tools for stream bank evaluation. The other source of information are like the FSA producer farm data reports and the farm track maps. Those will also help you with ownership information. All right, historical imagery. This is some cool stuff that a lot of people have put a lot of time into scanning a lot of the old imagery, so we have it available electronically. So this historical imagery is actually housed in Madison on a server, but it's available through the geodata layer files that, again, NRCS staff and some partner staff will have access to. Others may be able to request individual images of sites from those with access. If you look on this map on the right here, there's a few flights that are shown here in red. Some of those have PII or personally identifiable information. They've got potentially some tract boundaries, some acreages, some farm numbers. They may contain some wetland information. So those can't be released to other people. But we're getting more and more of this data available, and some of these are starting to become orthorectified so that they can be brought up and overlain over other sources of data. A lot of them aren't, where it just opens up a separate JPEG that you can look at. And I'll talk a little bit later about how we can make that work as well. But as you can see, a lot of this kind of started with scanning some of this in the Southwest area. So we have a lot more information available there, but almost all the counties have at least one data set from the mid 50s or 60s that would be good, helpful information. So everyone has access to the photos from the late 1930s through the Wisconsin State Cartographer's Office website. So the link is shown here, or if you Google Wisconsin SCO historical imagery, you can probably find it. Once you go to their homepage, you can see this historical aerial photography button at the bottom. And when you click on that, you go to this map. And on this map, you can kind of find your general location, and then you can click on these white dots, and it will show you a preview of the image so you can make sure that it's the image that you want. And then it allows you to download different resolution images as well. So there's small, medium, and large resolution images that you can download from here. So this is available from everybody. I believe that eventually some of those additional 1950s and 60s images that have been scanned in are going to be uploaded here as well. I think they're trying to find a way to serve that data up. But right now, I believe statewide, the late 30s photos are on here. One point I want to make is the late 1930 photos are great reference photos, but it's not necessarily a historical period we want to replicate for our restoration. So an incredible amount of stream alterations were completed prior to these photos, and significant changes in the watershed use leading up to these photos shows a fairly unstable and a dynamic time in stream history. So not only can you see recent alterations like straightening on these photos, but significant erosion and deposition in certain areas. So use these photos for reference documentation, historical documentation of stream straightening, but not necessarily a template for restoration. And that can be said for all of the photos that we have available.
Hey, Mike, Hallie Passal's got a question in the chat there as far as can land conservation departments reach out to NRCS to kind of get a hold of some of those photos?
That's a good question. I think some of those we may be able to pass off as a larger data set, if that's the question, rather than just doing individual sites at a time. So I will just make note of that and try to get back to you after the training with some options for you. All right, because this stuff is really good information, and I think it provides a lot of background on these projects that is really worth looking at, and it doesn't take that long. So the next question is, what are we looking for in historical imagery? So one of the big ones is what type of channel alterations have been done, and how does the reach that you're looking at, the reach in question, compare to adjacent reaches? So here's just an example of, I don't remember what year this is. This might be 1950s photography, but you can see the upper reach of the stream has not been straightened in the past, and you can see the meanders and what the channel kind of looks like. And then surprisingly enough, at a property line, it changes and the next section or the next reach is all straight. You can see some of the remnant oxbows in here as well. And if we go back to even earlier photos, the stream in the southern half of this photo is even straighter. So sometimes if you have questions on whether your site's been manipulated or not, sometimes you have to look out a little bit farther and see what the rest of the stream looks like. There's obviously areas that were manipulated, some that weren't, some were manipulated more than others, but just trying to gauge this and try to identify what the stream wants to look like, or what are problems that are caused by actual physical alterations of the stream that we've done in the past. So how active has the stream movement been? Has it changed more in the past or more recently? Sometimes we see periods where the channel appears more stable for so many years, and then all of a sudden it starts moving again. Sometimes that's due to recent heavy rain events. There's other periods where we had some pretty significant flooding in the 50s and 60s as well. So there's other things, changes in the watershed that you can kind of identify in these. Is the land use more intensive? Has there been tree clearing and additional cropping? Sometimes the watersheds look better than they used to. Maybe there's less pasture and more forest. Sometimes that changes how much base flow is in these channels. So sometimes the channels seem like they're getting larger from a base flow standpoint. And we have studies that have shown where the base flow in a lot of these channels has increased from the 50s and 60s to now, because there's more infiltration and better land use than there was at the time. So sometimes you can look at the stream itself, you can look at other portions of the stream, and sometimes you can look at the whole watershed in these old photos. So there's ways to overlay the historical imagery into ArcGIS. As you saw in that one map, there's a few of these data sets they're trying to ortho-rectify to get them so they line up better. But you can do it with georeferencing a few known points. So on this map, it's kind of hard to see, but there's 3 red X's on here, which are road intersections, where they actually could put those, click on the old map or the old photo and click on the existing map and kind of rubber sheet this to fit your site. So you can overlay this, you can change the transparency on the image so that you can kind of see through it, and you can line up the historical imagery to compare to more recent photos. So this is great for relative analysis, but not really for precise measurements. So I don't really want us taking the 1937 photos, putting them on here, doing a distance measurement and saying it's moved so many feet in the last 90 years, and that's how we're coming up with our movement or excess movement. So use it as a guide. It's really good for a planning document. I have some instructions on this. If I get to a break here or something, I'm going to try dropping those in the chat box so that you guys can have the instructions on overlaying those images. So by doing that, here's one thing that you can produce, which is actually a nice planning tool, and it's a nice way of kind of organizing that history into something that you can give to somebody else and say, here's what's going on with the site, without having them go through all of the imagery themselves. So on this particular site, the blue line is a tracing of the 1937 stream center line. And you can see even in 1937, the channel had been straightened some and was straightened through town. There's a large oxbow in it that still remained in 1937. A lot of the stuff towards the lower end of this photo, I think, was actually straightened a little bit already prior to 1937. Then you can look at the purple line on here, and that's the stream center line from 1968. And so you can see between 37 and 68 that oxbow was cut off and the stream was actually realigned through a different part of town. And then in 2020, the stream center line is in yellow there. And so you can see it has moved quite a bit between 1968 and 2020 as well. But the significant changes were prior to 1937 and then before 68. But this is just a really nice way of overlaying those and presenting it as a visual for other people to see as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this Wisconsin instruction. One of the items in here is that stream bank protection should not be used to maintain linear alignments or fix the boundary of natural streams. If it was straightened by artificial means, we should really be looking at an objective of restoring the plan form sinuosity. So protecting individual corners from, I'm sorry, I have a bad comment on my instructions here. So we shouldn't be rocking straightened streams so that which are trying to remeander to regain their original stream thread length and sinuosity. All right, so what do straightened streams look like and how do I know when I have them? So some of the straightened streams were obviously straightened. So this one, the stream was obviously straightened and the old channel remains there, so you can see where it was at the time, and there's no doubt about that. But a lot of times the old channel was filled in at the time to allow it to be farmed and is no longer available for reference. In this case, we wouldn't want to be rocking the reforming meanders at the upper end of this reach to try keeping it straight. This is also a great example of a potential restoration project. However, it would be a site that we could not apply stream bank protection on the upper meanders solely to control erosion. So this is an obvious stream straightening site. Some of them are less obvious. This one's pretty obvious too, where not the entire stream corridor was straightened, but just a portion of it where they straightened it out to be able to push it up against the hillside and gain some additional cropland. So obviously we don't want to keep rocking these to push it up and confine it just to protect cropland in this situation. But there's some other issues that straightened channels can have. Sometimes they still have sedimentation problems. So even though it's straight, it can still be inefficient at moving sediment. Sometimes the sinuous channels will kind of give a way to store sediment on point bars and then keep a thalweg and keep faster moving flow on the outside that'll move sediment through more efficiently. So here's just a visual on how different streams with point bars might be able to allow the sediment to breathe a little bit and accumulate at some times and keep it moving at others. And straightened channels have a harder time of kind of temporarily storing this sediment. So sometimes they were straightened in a way to get water off more quickly. Sometimes that moves sediment through the system quicker if it's a steeper watershed, but in some of these flatter ones, it not only is causing some erosion by creating these meanders, but is also creating a sedimentation problem as well. All right, here's a couple other stream straightening examples that I found that are interesting. Sometimes they didn't straighten the entire stream in a linear fashion that makes it easy to see. Sometimes they just selectively cut off oxbows. Now this one's pretty straight, but I've seen other situations where maybe a third of the oxbows are cut off on one side of the stream and filled in so that they can crop it more efficiently. And so the stream isn't straight as an arrow, but it's been straightened and it's straighter than it was historically. And so by cutting off some of these meanders, it can really decrease the length of the channel and have some pretty profound impacts. So some of the examples aren't quite as obvious as others. All right, so the other thing I wanted to mention is our NRCS engineering tool, which is a GIS tool set. They're widely used by the field offices to delineate watersheds. So I think most people that are on this call are familiar with the tool and how it delineates watersheds. The first step in doing that is a process that creates a site DEM and a hillshade that are also useful on these stream projects. So the visualization tools that the DEM and the hillshade provide for preliminary analysis of stream corridors is incredible. Old stream channels and different floodplain terraces are easy to identify. On the photo on the left, you can even identify the stream crossings where the banks have been pulled back for them to cross the stream. Crossover locations, area of interest for field surveys can often be identified by looking at this information. And we're also getting a second round of LiDAR in many counties, which we can now compare to the old DEMs, compare the new ones to the old ones to see changes over the last 10 years.
Mike, can you back up one slide and just,
Yep.
I just wanted to ask, take a moment to pause. Not armoring straightened streams is part of our policy now. Is there any questions on why we have that policy, why we wouldn't use taxpayers' dollars to maintain linear alignments? Is there any questions or concerns with that? Can you see how cutting off these meanders steepens the grade, which can entrench those streams, and so they're no longer in good contact with their floodplain? So all the storm flows put higher energy within the banks. That's one issue. And then the fact that these straightened streams, the one thing you'll notice about on a lot of straightened streams, it depends a little bit on grade, and maybe not so much in the driftless area as to other areas. But one of the first things you'll notice about a straightened stretch is it has no thaw-wig. The sediment is flush from one side to the other. There really is no, and when there's no thaw-wig, it implies there's no point bars, which means that the sediment basically buries the bottom. It buries the aquatic habitat. The riffle pool run sequences are missing. So those straightened reaches, they increase the amount of energy within the banks, and they invalidate the sediment transport mechanism. So, I mean, there's a reason we call it out. It isn't just because we don't like the look of it. I mean, there's fluvial mechanics involved that are just unsustainable. So we don't really want to waste our money on those streams, and we don't want to kind of promote that. So I don't know, does anybody else have any questions on that? It's one of the takeaways from that Wisconsin instruction. But I don't want people to say, well, we can't work on straightened streams because it's policy. That would be a disservice to your customer if you can't explain why. So it's pretty important that you dig a little deeper on what Mike was saying and just try to understand why. Help our agency defend that position a little bit because it's solid. Sorry, Mike, I'll let you go.
No, I think that's something that we've been struggling with. And I think if people have questions on what they can or can't do, again, feel free to send those up for an opinion. Sometimes it's hard to tell. We'll get into this in a couple slides of what was straightened, what wasn't straightened. One thing is if these streams were straightened and are trying to re-meander themselves because the grade is too high and because it's trying to regain its plan form, if we rock a couple spots, it's just going to find somewhere else to eat away at. And eventually you're going to almost have to rock the whole thing or just let it find spots that nobody cares about to let it go. So I think there are reasons that make sense as to why we wouldn't work on those. And Steve had mentioned a lot of them, but another one is just because it isn't going to solve the overall issue. And I think that's one thing we've got to keep in mind as we're doing these projects, is that we want to make sure that we're solving the impairment or at least identifying it, so that our projects can be successful. And not to say that we haven't had successful projects in the past, because we've done a lot of stream bank work over the years and a lot of it is still there, and I would consider it very successful. So
yeah, I think it's important that our agency continue to push our program specialists to if the landowners feel they're adversely affected by a sinuous stream, it's incumbent upon us to try to find programmatic incentives and alternatives to relax that adverse condition. And so, we do need to pull together packages that involve CRP and buffers and financial incentives like we do for everything else that we're trying to achieve. And I don't know if we've completely caught up to that. We're always kind of looking for some new ideas. And so please continue to move those up the ladder so that we can put out a carrot instead of a stick.
correct. I think that was one point that Steve and I wanted to make today too, and maybe I'm speaking for him, but I think he's mentioned this to me before. We have a lot of good practitioners in the state that have done a lot of good work over the years, and we're not trying to dismiss this or say that the work that's been done has been bad. It's just trying to tweak it a little bit and kind of move it in a new direction. We did the same thing. We had some watershed projects in the late 80s where we were rocking to the top of the bank, and we got some complaints about that, and we've since really lowered the height of our riprap. We've incorporated a lot more shaping, a lot more habitat, and I think the projects have been doing over the last few years have been a vast improvement of where we were years before that. And this is just kind of that next step to kind of keep pushing it in the right direction. All right, so rely on these NRCS engineering tools. These are also used by the wetland compliance team when they're doing wetland delineations, because you can see so much detail on them. Some of the new LiDAR data sets even are more detailed than the old ones. And so that's kind of what you're seeing in these two examples is one of the old 2010 DEMs. And then that's compared to the 2020. I think that one's in Sauk County, and you can just see an incredible amount of detail on these. So probably more detail than we would get even from a field survey where you're only getting a couple cross sections. All right, as we kind of continue through this planning process and analyze the resource data, a lot of times the inventory and analysis kind of go hand in hand here. A couple things I wanted to talk about here are meander pattern, sinuosity, and then resource concerns. So sinuosity is just a ratio of the stream length compared to the valley length. So the higher the sinuosity value, the more meandering the stream is. So a quick example, if the stream length here along the length of the center line of the stream is 1,500 feet and the valley length is 1,000, the sinuosity would be 1.5. So we almost always calculate this based on lengths, but as you see on this diagram here, method number 2 is to use slope ratios. The thing I wanted to mention about that is if this stream were straightened and the sinuosity was lowered, so the stream length was closer to the valley length, it actually increases the grade in the channel. And if we were to remeander a channel and add stream length back into it, we're going to decrease the channel grade. So the sinuosity goes hand in hand with the grade of the channel. The more sinuous the stream is, the lower the slope is to get from point C to D. And the steeper it is if you straighten it out going from point A to B. All right, so we had seen this picture before, which was just an example of what was a straightened stretch. I just ran some quick sinuosities on this. On the upper end, we're at 1.67. Through the straightened reach, we're 1.03. And the bottom end, it's actually 2.5. So it helps describe the straightness of the streams. So typical stable Roskin stream types have sinuosities of at least 1.2 for C-type channels and 1.5 for E channels. So a lot of times we see erosion on channels where the cross-section kind of matches a stable Roskin stream type, but the sinuosity is too low. And that's typical of streams that have been straightened in the past. And even with armoring a lot of the bends, it still may want to try lengthening out the stream length and meander between treatments. So if there's questions as to whether a stream was straightened in the past, examining this factor can help with that determination. And if you're under that 1.2 or 1.3 sinuosity, it probably had some work done where it was straightened in the past. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about resource concerns, and I hope to not spend too much time on this because you guys are fairly familiar with this, but the resource concerns have been slightly renamed in the last few years again. There's currently a spreadsheet with resource concerns listed and tools to document them available in our electronic field office tech guide section 3. However, it's currently being updated and should be reissued soon. Which again, just kind of gives you what the resource concerns are and the tools to use, and we're going to kind of go through those. So the first one we're going to look at is under soil erosion, and is bank erosion from streams, shorelines, or water conveyance channels. So the new standard requires assessing both the BPI, which is a bank erosion potential index, and determining a lateral migration or recession rate. The instruction says it should be measured at the apex of a channel bend using historical imagery over a period of 20 years. And it may be excluded or abbreviated if imagery is unavailable or obscured by canopy. I found that it's hard to get good imagery over time, and some of the best imagery we have is the 2010 and 2020 WROC imagery, and that only gives you a 10-year period. But if you can document a lot of movement over that 10-year period, which is the most recent 10 years, it's really good. And sometimes you can use that in conjunction with some of that historical imagery review as well. So the instruction is lateral migration greater than a half a foot per year, and that's really a minimum. I know there's a few sites I see once in a while where it's 0.46 or 0.42 and people are wanting to round up. This really is kind of a bare minimum. So if you're getting stuff that you can't hardly identify that 5 feet over 10 years from aerial imagery, we probably need more documentation than that. Sometimes it can be you know, pictures that the landowner has or a fence line when they put it in and how far it's gone back through that fence line. So there's other ways of documenting it in the field as well. So this image here, go ahead, Steve.
I'll just mention, you know, that the 1/2 foot per year was a reaffirmation by the NRCS State Technical Committee. There was some of us that really wanted to set the threshold between normal and excessive erosion at 1 foot per year average. But these decisions are made on an advisory basis, and our state tech committee wanted to stay a little bit closer to DNR regulations for permitting, which you have to demonstrate this level of erosion to kind of qualify for stream bank protection permits. And so it is a little bit of a negotiation, but as Mike said, we view it as a minimum in order to kind of sync it with the permitting. But from a fluvial geomorphic point of view, it's on the minimum edge. I mean, I would say erosion up to even 1 foot per year is probably what we would consider normal. Just streams exercising changes due to stronger hydrologic cycles or storms or sediment influx, things like that. Streams need to kind of breathe and move a little bit. So it is hard to set a line because every stream's different. They're all full of different soil types. Watersheds are different. So just wanted to provide a little context. Thanks, Mike.
Yep, so this picture here is just one of the worst sites I've seen. This moved about 100 feet in one storm event. So the red line is where it was prior to the storm event, and you can see the bank behind it. Not only is this bank about 8 feet high, the water depth on the outside of that bend was probably another 4 or 5 feet. So it was about 12 feet of material that moved out. It was pretty impressive to see, but that is excessive erosion. This instruction also allows for a BPI of 20 or greater, but really try to hang your hat on the recession rate. The BPI is a little bit, you know, it's part of the permitting process as well. And I know there's some pretty marginal sites that you can get some pretty high scores on. So if you can, try leaning on that excessive erosion of documenting that movement, which we do have the tools to kind of really be able to identify that. So lean on that one. Some sources for evaluating recession rates. Google Earth is easily accessible, but can also be easily misused. I'll show you a slide here coming up. Not all the year's images on Google Earth are of the same quality. Historical imagery can be used to show how the stream has changed over time, but again, exact measurement shouldn't be used from those photos either. The LiDAR 2-foot contours that a lot of the counties have, along with the WROC imagery, is the best information that I've seen. The NAPE photography that FSA flies that's leaf on every year is pretty good imagery, but with the trees being leafed out, and some of that is not quite as high resolution as the WROC imagery either. So try to lean on that. I know there are efforts being made that the WROC imagery is probably going to come more frequently than every 10 years. I think there's an effort out to get them done in 2025, and maybe some of it will even be done before that. So those images are really the best to use for this. So this is Google Earth, or even the other imagery that you use. Try to have some references that shouldn't be moving over time, such as a building, a bridge, or a road, to verify that your observed movement is from the stream and not the imagery. So I just went on Google Earth and traced out our office building here, and then I flipped back through the imageries, the different years of imagery, and in one year our east side of our building moved 12 feet. I see the west side must have moved a little bit too. I think the whole photo is not scaled quite right, which is kind of obvious on a building, but it's not so obvious when you're looking at one particular bend in a stream. You may think, well, it really moved that year, and I'm going to use that for documentation. So just be cautious of what you're using for imagery. Also be cautious if your stream is moving north and south from one year to the next and it's bouncing back and forth. That's definitely an indication that the imagery isn't accurate. All right, so again, the 2010 imagery and the old LiDAR contours that most counties have were flown about the same time and correspond quite well to each other. It does vary from county to county a little bit. And then everybody's LiDAR data sets are going to be a little bit different as well. But if you look at this example, this is the 2010 WROC imagery and the 2010 LiDAR imagery, and you can see the contour lines really match up with the bank of the stream. Now, in some cases, depending on your bank heights, you won't get a contour line that strictly follows the water's edge, but in a lot of cases you do. So this is just flipping to the 2020 WROC, the newer imagery, and maintaining that original base layer of LiDAR, which basically traced out our stream corridor from 2010. On here now, you can actually measure the difference, and in the upper corner here, I get 27 feet. And so that would equal 2.7 feet per year over the 10-year period. And then simple things such as measuring the width of the peninsula that's just down from that red line would be able to document movement of the stream as well. So there's a few different ways of doing it, but this is the two images and data sets that I like to use the most often. All right, the second resource concern we talk about quite a bit to justify need for stream projects is water quality. Water quality is also the reason why projects are allowed in the phosphorus trading program. So that resource concern would be nutrients transported to surface water, but those are coming directly from the soil eroded from stream banks in those cases. So typically, documentation of this resource concern is accomplished by showing erosion of other sources, either stream banks or fields. But supporting documentation could also be observations of excess sediment in the streams, such as the 303D listing or documented habitat degradation because of sediment deposition in the streams from fisheries or field observations. So some of this this is going to be more field observation, but trying to figure out whether the sediment issues are related to excessive erosion or just sediment transport issues of the stream itself. All right, the third resource concern I'm going to talk about a little bit is plant condition. So we often hear the issues related to box elder line corridors and where the canopy is preventing good grass cover. It encourages invasive species lots of times and leads to poor stream health. In some of these cases, these projects relate more to vegetation management than structural treatment. So in those cases where vegetation is the main problem or concern, we should look at this as one of our resource concerns to evaluate. One of the tools we have for documenting resource concerns is SVAP, or Stream Visual Assessment Protocol. It's a national protocol that provides an initial evaluation of the overall condition of wadable streams, the riparian zone, and in-stream habitats. It assesses visually apparent features within a specific reach of a corridor. So this is mostly a visual assessment, hence the name. Maybe it was too obvious, but it doesn't involve a lot of surveying or a lot of measurements being taken. It's a visual assessment. So there are actually 16 elements of the assessment in SVAP. Element number 4 and 5 are riparian area quantity and quality. And these can be used to document a plant condition resource concern. And we'll talk about this again a little bit later when we get to the alternatives. All right, the fourth resource concern that we typically look at for these streams is aquatic habitat. So stream habitat improvement is used to improve aquatic habitat, especially in trout streams. A lot of the other things that we're doing to create healthy stream channels and corridors will also allow the stream to create its own good habitat by providing, a reconnection to the floodplain and a properly sized channel, the channel kind of recreates some of those pools and riffles on its own as well. But adding habitat features into an otherwise impaired stream may not be successful, but adding them into an improved reach can kind of jumpstart the process and provide more immediate habitat. So the tool for documenting aquatic habitat is the Stream Habitat Suitability Index. These elements are taken from SVAP2, including bank condition, pools, and fish habitat complexity. We've done some field training on this in the past and continued to do more, and maybe in the future, some habitat field training. Habitat's really hard to evaluate from your desk. So, all right, this is a slide I've used before and just want to reiterate that we kind of have to align our alternatives with objectives of the projects. So we often hear the term stream restoration used, and I'm not sure that any of the projects I've worked on over the years would really be considered a true restoration. Most of the work we've traditionally done here in the Southwest has been for erosion control and for stream habitat improvement. However, many of the restoration concepts and components have been used for improving stream health, and I think we need to keep pushing towards that goal of using those components to improve our systems. But very few really reach the intent of a complete corridor restoration. I had showed you one earlier where we had a straightened stream and the old channel was still sitting there. We've got a couple potential projects where that may be the case, and I think as we encourage people to look this way, we're going to be able to find a few more of those, and hopefully in a few years we'll have a different way of looking at this and be able to show some of those success projects as well. So I do like to think of this a little bit as a continuum, because even if restoration is your final goal, there's often site constraints, landowner restrictions, financial limitations that limit the implementation of a full restoration. So we kind of want to use those components and head towards that as much as we can. And there's also a lot of overlap between these three. All right, so stream bank protection, as we talk about alternatives, it'll still be allowed as an alternative. Basically, documentation of excessive erosion is needed, and the treatment has to be limited to isolated bends and not be a continuous sequence of alternating sites. Consider protecting the outside edges of the floodplain belt width where the stream is cutting into higher banks. And also be aware of sites undergoing changes in the watershed or other stream adjustments. If the site has nearly every corner showing movement and the system is not stable, isolated riprap bends usually won't solve the overall problems. You can use it to protect individual sites, but we really aren't going to address the underlying problem. So how much isolated riprap can I do before I have to do the additional assessments? So this criteria is both from the Wisconsin instruction and it's in the 580 standard as well. So we can do a single site up to 500 feet or a combination of existing and planned protection up to 1,000 feet in a quarter-mile reach. If you exceed these two limits, one or the other, then you have to complete the additional site assessment found in open channel. I've got a slide coming up here that'll kind of visually show this, but basically if you exceed this limit, then you really want to be looking at those additional objectives of maintaining sediment transport continuity, connecting the channel to the floodplain, matching the stream type dimensions to a stable setting, and restoring natural plan form if we can. So a quarter-mile reach is just a quarter mile along the stream corridor measured along the center line of the stream. So it's not a 40 where the stream meanders through it. It's literally a quarter-mile stretch of the river. If a single site exceeds 500 feet, like this blue line, you would automatically have to go to the 582 assessment. Don't break this with just a 10-foot section in the middle of it and say, I've got two 250-foot reaches. Just if the entire stretch here is over 500 feet, we'll have to go to the additional assessment. Again, by going to the additional assessment, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do the project. It just means that we have to take a little bit deeper dive into what's going on with the stream and make sure that that's the best alternative. All right, existing and planned. So if the the purplish blue one was your planned one, but there's 2 existing sites on there and all 3 of those added together exceeds 1,000 feet, then you would require the additional assessment. And we can't break up our site into 2 quarter-mile reaches and say, well, this is in one reach and one is in the other. Basically, you'd have to be able to draw any quarter-mile line, you can't exceed that amount. All right, so the next couple slides here, I'm just going to cover some do's and don'ts for applying 580, because I think that's one of the underlying questions that we get quite often, and why I wanted to have this training before jumping into the further site assessments of 582 in the next 2 training. So we've already talked about the length limits. So a short list of do's that can be used to plan smaller projects. Do document excessive erosion to justify the use. Do use it for isolated bends, and do use it on relatively stable systems. There's still quite a bit of documentation and assessment required by the 580 standard itself, but it's less than the 582 assessments. So smaller projects that can meet the criteria laid out in today's training can keep proceeding. And if you have questions, please put together some basic planning documents and photos and ask for an opinion from your area staff. The don't slide is a little bit longer. However, this doesn't mean that after doing the additional assessment that riprap can't be used or incorporated into a larger corridor project. Sometimes the answer is going to be the same after doing the additional assessments, and sometimes it'll need to be modified slightly. So again, we don't want to use it to maintain linear alignment of straightened streams. Don't rock every bend. And then don't use it in systems undergoing rapid changes that are, or the ones that are inherently unstable to begin with. The patchwork won't fix a system instability problem. All right, so it's really hard to define the isolated banks, but this is the example I showed before just to kind of remind people of that.
Yeah,
all right,
Mike.
580. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess I just had a couple of quick comments. That 500-foot and 1,000-foot thresholds, you know, those are pretty lax, really. But if you exceed them for certain, the standard is trying to encourage assessment so that you're not going into large projects single-minded, that you dump $50,000 worth of taxpayers' money and you mobilize 75 dump trucks full of rock. And when the project's all done, you look in the stream and you find out there was a sedimentation problem. There is no thaw wig. And so the thresholds are almost a redirection to consider multiple resource concerns. And I just kind of wanted to mention that it's not so much that there's some magic ecological threshold out there about so many lineal feet of rock. But it's what it's saying is if you're going to invest public money into a project that starts exceeding that scope, then we want to make sure that while we're at it, we're addressing as many impairments as we can. And the whole SVAP and the HSI Habitat Suitability Index, those sound like laborious index type inventories, when in reality, much of it can be obtained just by walking the stream and looking at it and saying, does it have hydraulic character? And a lot of times that's all removed by sedimentation. And so, I don't know, I just kind of wanted to add that in there, that it's not because we have a programmatic limit on the lineal feet of rock riprap. It's simply laying out some thresholds to try to redirect your attention to multiple resource concerns when these projects scale up to a certain size. Does that make sense? I don't know. I just thought I'd throw that out there. Sorry.
Nope, that's fine. That's fine, Steve. It gives me a chance to catch my breath and collect my thoughts too, because I didn't quite get this in all my notes that sometimes get caught up in reading here. But I think a lot of what Steve had mentioned is I don't want people to get hung up in that number. And I really don't want people thinking, boy, I can do 990 feet and it'll fly under the radar and nobody will come looking at it. The question really is, what is your intent for the project? So if your intent is really to protect a few isolated banks, you can still do that through 580. If your intent is to restore or fix or address an entire stream corridor and you want to do it kind of holistically, don't go in there and just riprap every corner. So you may do that and it's only 900 feet in a quarter mile and you've got a half mile of stream. So you're actually doing, almost 2,000 feet of riprap. It's really more what your intent is. And if your intent is to fix the stream corridor and really address all those resource concerns, then let's do the additional assessment and see what other issues there are and what else we can address, and maybe what we can address in a more efficient manner than just rocking. So good. All right, on to a couple more kind of don'ts. The 580 standard contains some critical sites to be cautious of when applying stream bank protection. Two of these are, well, one is entrenched channels, and the other is headwater channels with colluvium, cobbles, and boulders. So colluvium and alluvium can kind of have overlapping definitions, but we're kind of looking at alluvium as characterized by transport of the water during somewhat normal flows. It's the stuff that typically deposits in floodplains and moves through the system. Colluvium is more associated with rapid mass movement in upland gullies, ravines, hill slopes. It's kind of that dump that comes out of like the flash flooding events. So when you see the stuff in the streams that's bigger than the riprap you would be proposing to put in, those are definitely areas to be cautious of. And those are coming out of the hillsides and kind of larger events than what we would be designing for. The standard also says not to install bank protection in systems undergoing rapid and extensive changes in bottom grade or alignment, unless you control or accommodate the changes. So if through our assessments, we've identified significant system instabilities, applying stream bank protection may not be appropriate or solve the underlying problems. So in this picture, you can see the eroded bank in the background on the left. But what may not be obvious here is where the channel was before the last flood event. It was actually where this blue line is shown. So where stream bank protection was done, now no longer is even the stream channel, and now it's moved over and is attacking a new location. And we see this quite often, and this is something that can a lot of times be identified through some of those historical imagery reviews, that this stream is moving so much that, again, stream bank protection isn't going to necessarily solve the problem unless you're really trying to protect one or two isolated areas. Then if the stream moves away from it, we don't really care, right? Our area is still protected. But the riprap is not solving the stream stability or instability issues. All right, so one of the other questions for alternatives is 342 critical area planning. Can I just remove the trees, shape the banks back at a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1, and reseed without all this additional documentation and the additional assessment? So the short answer is no. And although there have been successful projects completed using this in the past, right now we're going to ask for additional documentation and analysis needed before this can be completed. So is the stream system stable? Typically, if all we're doing is sloping it back at a 3-to-1, it doesn't alter the stream cross section. It doesn't reconnect things to the floodplain. It doesn't change the stream type. It may allow for vegetation to be established, and in some cases that may be all that's necessary, but we would want to do additional analysis to determine what the stable cross section should look like. And really, if we're simply doing this for vegetation management, right now the only option we would have is using a 391 riparian forest buffer option that I'm going to cover here in just a second. So again, the short answer is no. The long answer is, if we do an evaluation of the site and just shaping and seeding is the correct alternative, it may be an option, but it would require additional assessment. And part of that assessment might be determining whether 3-to-1 is the right number, or 4-to-1, or 8-to-1, or whether a bench is needed or some other option in there. Whether we would need to narrow up the channel in addition to shaping the banks back. And so trying to look at a more comprehensive solution, which this may be a part of, but not a standalone. The other issue is sometimes what works on a 200-foot stretch of the stream may not be appropriate to apply over both sides of a half-mile of stream. So if we tell you that you can just shape and seed, and it's a 200-foot site, it may be successful, but now somebody else says, well, everybody's going to like this, and we're going to do it over 2 miles, and over a 2-mile stretch, we cut down all the trees, shape all the banks back, and reseed it. We've really altered the entire stream corridor at that point, and need to do a little bit further assessment before we do that. All right, so I know the field has kind of asked for this practice where we can just remove box elders and shape the banks. So this alternative developed is available under practice 395, stream habitat improvement. The resource concerned to justify this practice is plant structure and composition that we discussed earlier, the SVAP elements 4 and 5. If you average those two scores together and your existing score is less than a 5, you have a resource concern. Currently, the practice is only allowed on class 1, 2, or 3 trout streams, and it must be approved by the state biologist prior to contracting. I think last year we had this available. There were a few sites that were evaluated, and I think one is actually getting implemented this fall. So we should have better examples for you in the future of what this might look like. So the clearing, shaping, and replanting are all inclusive in this practice payment. It's paid for per acre. And last year was approximately 7,000 per acre, but the rates this year will likely be different. You can see on here the widths kind of can vary between 35 and 100 feet typically. A new guidance document is being developed. And hopefully that'll be completed before the next year's cookbook comes out. So Steve Burgeons is really the contact for more information on this practice. A couple extra items with that is we can do some shaping of the banks, especially if you're grubbing out the trees, which will disturb the soil anyway. There's no requirements as far as the final slope of the stream bank requirements. It's more just shaping the disturbed area. And then the stream bank zone can be planted to 100% shrubs, but the next zone out must contain a minimum of 50% trees. So this isn't a clear and replace with grass. It's clear the bad trees and replace with better native trees and shrubs. The planting rates shall not be less than 400 stems per acre, but that's a little bit less than we would do on a typical tree planting. And then the shrubs and the trees have to be a little bit longer or larger, and 50% of it must contain shelters or cages. So we want to make sure that that planting has a chance for success and that it's going to stay there over the long term. So then our other alternatives that we've talked about is moving towards open channel. When we get to open channel, kind of some of those objectives again are modifying the cross section to make it more stable, improving the width to depth ratio, trying to reconnect it to the floodplain, balance sediment transport, which may involve either widening or narrowing the stream itself, and then restoring plan form to the extent practical if we can. But that's kind of more what we're going to get into in the next couple training sessions through the additional site assessment, both the webinar and the field day. Oh, one of my goals at the beginning of this training was to kind of cover what things could be done without the additional site assessments and some of that background information that we can gather. So unfortunately, there's limited options that we can do on a broad scale without doing the extra assessment and diagnosing the root causes of the problems, but really doing some of those isolated riprap sites, going through 580 and doing the assessment that's involved in there. If we're really looking at just vegetation practices, this riparian forest buffer is an option. But other things we want to do, whether it's large scale habitat projects, anytime we want to go into a quarter or a half mile of stream and really fix the whole stream and address the resource concerns through that entire corridor, we should be looking at doing a larger assessment. So one last reminder here that there's 2 additional trainings planned at this time. Please note that the field day may have limited attendance. I don't know. I think we've got maybe 100 people online today. I know some of our trainings earlier this year were a couple hundred people, and we just aren't going to be able to accommodate that many people on a field day, or it will not be helpful to anybody. So look for more information coming out on these sessions soon. I think we'll also need kind of some future training past these 2 to help incorporate how we use all that assessment information into actual designs. And some of this is going to be just what you guys have always done in the past, is use the available guidance and information you have and just start planning some projects. I would encourage a lot of dialogue on planning those projects early in the process so that we can make sure that we're not spending time going down a path that eventually won't be approved. So kind of doing some preliminary designs and getting the concepts approved before going to more future or complete designs. The other thing is, we're trying to get better guidance on how to do this stream assessment and make things more useful. So area engineering staff would be available to come out and help do some of those assessments or give you some ideas on how to do it yourself. I know I've done a few sites where I've just kind of laid out potential cross-section areas that I can see based on that watershed tool and how the DEM looks and where I can identify crossover sections. And again, those may need to be adjusted in the field when you're actually doing them, but it would be a good starting point and give you some ideas on planning. So that is kind of what I have for the presentation. I do have a little bit of time here for some questions, and I really try on these webinars to get done before time instead of running over. So Steve, if you have any other comments or if anybody else has any questions, we can take those now.
I guess I just wanted to mention that I'm sure by now people have gotten the impression that this seems like it's a lot of hard work, and it may be to stretch your mind around some things that you never thought about before. But I do think eventually you'll be able to just kind of walk the stream, and you will quickly, especially if you're sticking in a county with certain stream types, that you're going to quickly be able to identify the impairments, and you'll run just the tools that are necessary to support your conclusion, and you'll be able to move forward. I honestly think it's that straightforward. By now, I'm getting the sense that, you know, the three objectives for stream restoration, or the three assessment, or the four objectives for stream restoration, or the four objectives we want you to consider when you're looking at copious amounts of 580, really don't take too long. The first one is bank erosion. And I think by now you're kind of should be kind of rock solid on what it takes for us to justify a bank erosion problem. It's just looking at some imagery and kind of looking at the rate of recession. So I think that's within everyone's grasp. Secondly, sedimentation or sediment transport. That's like the #1 habitat killer. And there's more problems out there than not. And it's very frustrating to go out to a stream restoration project or a stream improvement project, and you see all of this investment, and yet you look in the stream and you'll notice it's missing a thalweg, or it's missing a point bar. You know, the stream has either been over widened and we didn't bother to correct it, or there's an obstruction in the stream bed gradient, you know, like a stream crossing that was put in too high, or a culvert crossing that's too high, or something like that, that's basically backing up sediment and burying habitat. And thirdly, you got straightened reaches where there is no thalweg. So either over widened streams, or elevated channel beds, or straightened streams create these sedimentation problems. And I think it doesn't take too much to start to really observe that quickly in the field and realize that that really should be part of the project if you can get it taken care of. The third one is plan for making sure it has an appropriate plan form, so that you're not setting course to correct a bank erosion problem when you really have a plan form issue. And Mike talked about that today. I mean, you need to start seeing some sinuosity at greater than at least 1.2. So that's not so hard to identify. And then fourth is the channel in good contact with its floodplain. And that can be a little tricky, but the next two courses, you know, you hear a lot about this rosin classification. It's not a prescription in itself. It's just a tool to help you decide whether the stream's in good contact with its floodplain. And so we'll cover that in the next section. But it all kind of boils down to those four assessments: bank erosion, sedimentation, plan form, and whether the stream has good connectivity with its floodplain. You can check the box on those 4 items and run a tool or two to support those conclusions. You're kind of on your way to the right solution. But if you quit anywhere along that process, if you're just looking at bank erosion and you skip the other 3, that's a problem. And so the standard is doing what it can to force you to look beyond the bank erosion assessment only, because that's the reason you were called out there. Most likely that's our customer's #1 concern. But we've positioned the standard to kind of force you to look at those other 3 assessments. And like I said, you don't run the tools first. You go out and you make these observations for these impairments, and they should be, you look at enough streams and it's going to stick out to you, and then you're going to say, oh yeah, I'm not quite certain here. And then it's going to dawn on you that it would be helpful to have a tool to support you. And so all of a sudden you see the tools not as an encumbrance, but as just a helpful feature in completing your inventory. So anyways, I'm trying to I just don't want people walking away saying that this is overwhelming, overcomplicated, because there's a lot of good work to be done out there. It's just a matter of getting kind of a trained eye so that you can see these impairments, and then support your conclusions. And now, not just race out there and do Roskin and race out there and do a BPI, hoping that when you get to the bottom of those forms, it tells you what to do, because you're going at that in reverse. And all you're going to do is just get confused, and your customer's going to look at you like you're confused. So anyways, sorry, I'll kind of open it up to questions, because that was the intent of this extra time. So.
I think that was a good summary, Steve, and kind of a precursor for the next couple trainings, right?
Yeah, I think so. It's we'll be largely led by Scott Borchardt and Tim Weisbrod. They're geologists, and that's part of the basic course curriculum for geologists is fluvial geomorphology. And so we felt it was appropriate that they provide some leadership in kind of running these assessment tools. But that's the nature of the next 2 courses, is to be kind of focused on running the tools, but you need to be kind of rock solid on why you need to run the tools, and they'll try to cover some of that. But by now, I guess if you just stay focused on those 4 objectives for stream restoration and make sure you have those 4 bases covered to the extent possible, you're going to be in good shape, because there are going to be cases where you can address 3 but not the 4th due to a property line or a utility or just the owner's interest. But that's okay. I mean, that's better than not considering it at all. Yes. So there's a difference between laying out to the landowner what this stream system should look like, and then work your way back from the physical constraints that are on your plate, than it is to go out there short-sighted and say, we can or can't help you with the bank erosion problem, and they've never had the opportunity to look at, you've never painted the big picture for them, because you didn't have the ability to do that, or you didn't apply that level of inventory to the job. So
All right, Isabel, I think that's about what we had. I see Tony has a comment in the chat box, but everybody can read that and understand where he's coming from. I don't know that we need to discuss it further. It's a good comment that this will take a little bit more time and we need to just kind of keep moving forward on it, and that everybody understands where we're going.
Okay, then. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Mike and Steve, for sharing all of this.